All right. Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming to our first Rose meeting of 2021. Hope to see you guys at all the rest of them as well. It is my great pleasure this afternoon to introduce Dr. Liz Barnes from Middle Tennessee State University. So Liz did both her bachelor's, master's, PhD, and her postdoc at Arizona State University. For the last three portions of that, she worked with Dr. Sarah Brownell, doing work that she's going to talk about today on the interaction between religious belief and acceptance of evolution, and kind of how that plays into how we teach evolution at the university level and elsewhere. She has already published around 17 papers, I believe, from her Arizona State work, which is pretty amazing. And just last August, in one of the weirdest times to do such a thing, she started her faculty position at Middle Tennessee State. So she looks like she's hanging in there and getting off to a really great start at Middle Tennessee. We're really glad to have her here today for our Rose meeting. So Liz, take it away.
Thank you, Jeff, so much, and thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here today virtually. I'm sorry that I can't be there with you all in person. I'm excited to be talking today, like Jeff said, about using religious cultural competence in evolution education and students' religiosity and their acceptance of evolution. But before I get started, I do want to acknowledge that I didn't do this work alone. We have a whole team that has helped with these studies, and particularly one of our team members, Sarah Brownell, told me yesterday that she actually presented some of our work on religious cultural competence at UAB just a couple of years ago. So you might have seen some of this in her talk, but we have a lot of updates that I'm excited to be giving you all as well today if you've seen some of this before. All right, so evolution is really foundational to biology. It's considered the foundation of the entire discipline, and yet it remains controversial among both the public and our college students. So this is a Gallup poll. You might be familiar with these data they've been collecting over the last 30 years or so about whether or not people accept human evolution. And over the last 40 years, it hasn't changed much. Only about half of the American public say that they accept evolution. But what might be even more surprising to you is that this is not restricted to the general public. So one of our recent studies published last year found that nationwide, 35% of incoming biology students do not accept that life shares a common ancestor. So why? Why is this the case? Why is it that evolution is so foundational to biology and biology education, and yet so controversial among both our students and the public? So now I'm going to ask you to get a little bit involved, because research shows in biology education that if I ask you to be active in the talk, that you'll be more likely to remember it later. So why don't you think students accept evolution, and what can or should instructors do to increase student acceptance of evolution? And I'll give you about 45 seconds or so to throw some ideas in the chat there. As somebody said, Adam and Eve. There are misconceptions, right? So religion-related things as well as content misconceptions. It has a religious dimension, right? Cultural beliefs, right, which can be related to religion. They don't think science and religion are compatible. It's controversial. Yeah, okay. All right, thank you for that. Yeah, so some of these things are things I'm going to talk about in my talk today. So for a talk outline, I'm going to start by claiming that in order to teach evolution effectively, that we need to try to reduce the perceived conflict between religion and evolution, and that the religious cultures and beliefs of evolution and evolution instructors and the students that they're teaching are often very different from one another, and that this difference in religious cultures and beliefs between instructors and students can actually present a barrier for effective evolution instruction. And then I'm going to offer a potential solution in the form of a framework that we've created called religious cultural competence in evolution education. And then I'll spend a lot of the talk exploring studies that we've done on the impact of religious cultural competence in evolution education, so you can see some of the evidence for the efficacy of that framework. Okay, so first, addressing the perceived conflict between religion and evolution is often required to effectively teach evolution. So us researchers who study perceptions of controversial science topics often talk about accuracy-oriented versus identity-protective cognition. So as science instructors, we often want and expect students to be accuracy-oriented. So that is, as they learn more about a topic, they also accept that it is a real thing that's happening. Further, this relationship between acceptance and understanding shouldn't be related to one's social identity. And that is what we see with topics that aren't controversial, so like photosynthesis. However, with topics that are controversial, we see identity protective cognition, so that among one group of people, having a greater understanding of the topic does not make them more likely to accept it. So climate change is a good example of a topic in which people engage in identity protective cognition. So these are data gathered from Pew Research Center on acceptance of climate change, broken down by both political affiliation and level of science knowledge. So among Democrats, the more they know, the more they accept climate change. But among Republicans, not so much. We are seeing identity protective cognition among this group. So what about evolution? How do people actually reason about that? Well, religiosity is an extremely impactful factor for whether someone is going to accept evolution. So consider this graph, which breaks down the relationship between accepting and understanding evolution by religiosity levels. So the x-axis is the number of answers that someone gets correct on an evolution knowledge test, right? While the y-axis is the probability that someone will think evolution is true. So as would be expected when teaching most topics in biology, as people understand the topic better, they're more likely to accept it. However, there are gaps between students with different religious identities, right? So the non-religious students are almost 100% likely to accept evolution if they fully understand evolution. However, for religious students, even if they get all of the answers on an evolution test correct, they still only have about a 50% chance of thinking evolution is true. So religiosity can be a strong barrier to evolution acceptance, and having understanding of evolution actually impacts that acceptance. So facts about evolution and evidence for evolution are often not enough to change someone's mind who rejects evolution because of their religious identity. If evolution instructors want to increase acceptance, then they may need to reduce the perceived conflict between religion and evolution. All right, so now I want to talk about how the religious cultures and beliefs of evolution instructors and their students are often different. So these are data that were gathered by Gallup Research Association, as well as research studies looking at the religiosity of academic scientists. So in the general population, we see about 90% of the American public say that they believe in God. But when we look at biologists, that number drops to about 25%. And when we look at evolutionary biologists, they're about the least religious group ever polled in history, with only about 10% of them saying that they believe in God. But what about our students in our classes? How do they stack up? Well, our studies find that 65% of college biology students nationally are religiously affiliated, and that 45% of them consider themselves a religious person. So what this means is we have this really unique situation that I've become somewhat obsessed with studying over the last 5 or 7 years, in which mostly non-religious biologists are teaching evolution to a large percentage of religious students, when religious identity is going to be the most important factor for whether or not the students are even accepting what they're being taught, right? So now I want to talk about how this difference in culture and belief between instructors and students can actually present a barrier for effective evolution instruction, and some of the studies that we've shown that have revealed this gap. So when we first got started doing this work back in like 2014 through 2015, we really just wanted to know, well, how are evolution instructors addressing perceived conflict when they teach evolution? We had some of our own experiences and stories from students, but we didn't really know what instructors' perspectives were. And so we interviewed 38 evolution instructors at public universities, but we also did want to officially get student perspectives. So we also interviewed 28 Christian students who were taking biology courses about their experiences learning evolution and how instructors were addressing perceived conflict. So in our interviews with instructors, we asked them if they were discussing religion when they taught evolution, if they thought that if they were trying to do anything to make religious students more comfortable learning evolution. And we also asked them a little bit about their own background and if they had ever experienced a worldview conflict with evolution and religion in the past. And what we found in these interviews is that most instructors at public universities were not addressing perceived conflict. They weren't even mentioning religion at all when they were teaching evolution. And this kind of surprised us because the literature had shown some promise that having these discussions would have a positive impact on students. So when we asked instructors why they weren't doing this, they often cited their own lack of religious beliefs that made them uncomfortable talking about religion in the classroom, their own lack of training on issues surrounding religion and evolution, as well as the fact that they had some negative stereotypes themselves about the compatibility of religion and evolution. So for instance, this is just one quote from Samuel, who said, and these are all pseudonyms, obviously. So from Samuel, who said that at the beginning of his class every year, his genetics class, that he would start with what he called a sermon. And he would say, I would say to my class, there's a terrible wind in America that is trying to impose religion as science. It's out to destroy America because it is not simply evolution. Evolution is built on genetics, chemistry, and physics, all of the sciences. If you believe in creationism, you can't believe in any of the foundations of sciences, and that will destroy America. You will destroy America. So you can imagine, and he said that his TAs, his teaching assistants, always got a kick out of this speech, right? But like, could you imagine being a religious student coming into the classroom, already nervous whether or not your religious beliefs could be compatible with evolution, and then having this be kind of the first introduction to some of that material? All right, so that was our instructor perspective, but we didn't quite know what student perspectives were yet. So we interviewed students who were taking biology courses at public universities who identified as Christian, and asked them if they had ever been influenced by their instructors, you know, about what they talked about religion and evolution, and if their instructors had said anything about religion and evolution when teaching them. And what we found is that Christian students were very well aware of the fact that instructors had negative attitudes towards religion, and they even cited it as a barrier for their learning evolution. So for instance, Maria, she talked about how she thought instructors were antagonistic towards religion. She said, I think professors present evolution religion in a way that is conflictual. I mean, in the first lecture of evolution class we went through, he kind of lumped religious faith in with magic. He's like, they believed in magic, and obviously that's wrong. Then they believed in creationism. He's like, obviously no one believes in magic, right? So he took something like her religious identity or something about religion that she finds very important, and then compared it to something that most people would consider a farce or false or not real. And what was also interesting is that some students talked about how even when instructors avoided talking about religion, which is what instructors said they were doing, like most of the time they said they were just avoiding it. They said even when instructors avoided it, they just assumed that religion and evolution had to be in conflict, maybe because of the prevalent perception that these two things are in conflict. So by avoiding the topic, the instructors aren't necessarily like mitigating the conflict. They might just be letting that perception of conflict continue. All right, so what these two kind of first interview studies that we did showed us is that instructors of evolution are not addressing perceived conflict, sometimes due to their own backgrounds and beliefs about religion. And those beliefs are pretty different from their students, and their religious students notice these differences and their attitudes. So what is the solution? So we wanted to offer a potential solution with a new framework that we created called Religious Cultural Competence in Evolution Education. So what is cultural competence? Well, it is the ability of people from one culture to understand and effectively communicate to people of another culture. So this was a framework that was born out of healthcare studies, as well as K through 12 education studies, in which they were trying to find ways to bridge the cultural differences between doctors and patients, as well as teachers and students, in terms of things like their race, ethnicity, or their socioeconomic status. And some of this work has shown to be helpful for patient and student outcomes. So we took this framework and we adapted it to take into account not racial or ethnic or socioeconomic differences, but religious differences between secular instructors teaching evolution and the religious students that they're teaching evolution to. So this framework includes a suite of evidence-based practices that can help reduce students' perceived conflict between religion and evolution. So what do these actually look like? So this is a list of what we call RISI. So you might hear me say RISI, that's just a short acronym, RISI practices. And just to be clear, all of these practices are things that were published in the literature previously with evidence that's shown that they might be effective for helping reduce students' perceived conflict or increasing their acceptance of evolution. But this was the first time that somebody had brought all of these practices together under an umbrella framework with the goal of helping bridge this cultural divide between instructors and students. Okay, so what are some of these practices? So first, you can just acknowledge the religious students in the room who might experience a conflict while learning evolution, right? So oftentimes we just ignore student identities, but if you actually acknowledge that students might be feeling a little conflictual, then it shows that you care and they feel a little bit more cared about and perhaps respected. You can also encourage exploration of personal views on religion and evolution rather than discouraging discussion or exploration. Oftentimes people need time to reflect on their views in order to change them. So if we actually want to reduce students' perceived conflict or increase their acceptance of evolution, we actually have to give them a chance to reflect on their own views in order to change those views. We can also describe to students the spectrum of viewpoints that exists on the relationship between religion and evolution. So what do I mean by that? Well, one thing that's become really clear in our research is that students tend to come into class with a misconception that you either have to be a special creationist who rejects evolution and believes in God, right? Or you have to be an atheist who accepts evolution, right? And in fact, one of our recent studies found that more than half of college biology students thought that someone would have to be an atheist to fully accept evolution. But the reality is there's actually a whole range of position in between these two extremes in which people both accept evolution and believe in God. And these views aren't in direct conflict with scientific evidence. So for instance, like theistic evolution is an idea that people have talked about. So then we can also present individuals with examples of religious leaders and biologists who accept evolution. So we call this like religious role models. So for instance, the director of the National Institutes of Health, Francis Collins, is also an evangelical Christian. He was also on the team that led the team that completed the first human genome project. As well as Theodosius Dobzhansky, who was a pioneer of the modern evolutionary synthesis and famously said that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. Most people don't know that in that very same essay, he also talked about how evolution and religion could be compatible. We can also show students the Clergy Letter Project, which is a letter of over 14,000 signatures from religious leaders signed to promote the harmony between religion and evolution. We can also discuss with students the nature of science and distinguish science and religion as different domains of knowledge. So sometimes we call this discussing the bounded nature of science. And this is the idea that science is a tool, right? And it helps us answer a certain set of questions, right? Questions about the natural world using natural explanations, the how, when, where, what is the natural cause of something. Whereas philosophy and religion can sometimes be seen as being more appropriate for answering questions about the purpose of life or the existence of God or how one ought to live. And although these two areas can potentially inform one another, if they don't ask the same questions, then they don't have to overlap. And finally, underlying all of these strategies is this idea that we're trying to highlight potential compatibility between religion and evolution. The fact is that most students are exposed heavily to the areas in which evolution and religion can be in conflict. And so now by providing them areas in which evolution and religion can be compatible, it provides them with a bridge between their religious identity and what they're learning from evolution. Okay, so now we know all those practices though from my interviews, right? That first study that we did, that instructors said they weren't really using these practices and maybe because of their religious background. So we got to thinking, well, are there contexts in which instructors might be using it more. And if our hypothesis is that the reason it's not being used is a disconnect between the instructor and student culture, maybe if we explored a context in which there wasn't a disconnect, we would see more of this instruction. So we decided to interview instructors teaching evolution at Christian universities. So this is a context in which the instructors are Christian and the students are Christian, so we don't have that cultural disconnect between students. And when we interviewed these instructors, almost all of them, I believe it was 31 out of 32 instructors, were all using the religious cultural competence practices that we had asked them about in our interviews. And when we asked them why they were doing this, they didn't have to be doing this. Why were they doing this? They cited their own experiences and religious background and difficulty, struggling through the conflict between religion and evolution as a reason they were doing this. So for instance, Andrew said, I very definitely experienced a conflict, and it's part of the reason I'm so interested in how we teach evolution where I teach now. I feel like there would be value in someone who's been through that, working with the students, rather than someone who has never been through it. I've got absolutely wonderful friends who are atheists and teach evolution, and they're not going to have the same ability to understand what students are struggling with that I might have, having come from a similar type of background. So really then affirming that this difference in culture or similarity in culture can make a big difference for what instructional practices are being implemented. Okay, so what about the evidence for the efficacy of these practices, though? So now I'm going to talk about a series of studies that we've done over the last few years, exploring the potential impact of religious cultural competence on undergraduate biology students. So one of the first studies we did was one in which we surveyed 60 introductory biology students on their religiosity and their perceived conflict between religion and evolution, both before and after an evolution module. And we asked them on those surveys to, in a few sentences, briefly describe your views on the relationship between religion and evolutionary theory. So they were surveyed before and after the evolution module, and then during the evolution module, we taught all the normal things that you usually teach when you teach evolution, but we also taught religious cultural competence. So we presented viewpoints on religion and evolution, a spectrum of viewpoints. We had a religious scientist come and visit the class and talk about his journey reconciling religion and evolution. And we also described and had a lesson on the bounded nature of science. So then we took student responses before and after the evolution module, and we put them into one of three categories. So either the students' response indicated that they thought evolution and religion had to be in conflict, the students' response indicated that evolution and religion were compatible, or some students' responses were too unclear to be put in either category. And there are examples of each kind of response under each of those categories. All right, and this is what student responses, these are the categories that student responses fell into before the evolution module. So now I want you to take a second and put on your thinking cap, predict on your own, what do you think these percentages were after using religious cultural competence? I'll give you about 15 seconds to think on your own. Okay, so after using religious cultural competence, we reduced the percent of students that perceived conflict between religion and evolution by half, and similarly increased the number of students that perceived evolution and religion could be compatible by half. However, not everybody changed. We had about 27% of students that started and ended the evolution module perceiving that the two were in conflict. And we had 15% that started and ended the module thinking that they were compatible. We were really proud of the fact that not a single student moved towards a perception of conflict over the evolution module. So it is possible to teach evolution without arising conflict in your students, which we thought was pretty cool. And finally, we saw 32% of the class actually moved towards a perception of compatibility over the evolution module. But we've been talking a lot about how these kinds of things are different depending on student religious identity. So I want you to think a little bit deeply about this. Which students changed to a compatibility perception? We measured their religiosity. Was it religious students that changed, non-religious students that changed, or both? And then I want you to think, why do you think that, right? Justify your reasoning. And I'll give you about 15 seconds for that. Okay, so if you said religious students, you are correct. So 28% of religious students started and ended the evolution module perceiving so changed towards perceiving evolution and religion as compatible. However, we also saw that among non-religious students. So 34% of our non-religious students actually moved towards a perception of compatibility over the evolution module. So these are just some examples of student responses that changed before and after the evolution module. So this is a religious student. They said before instruction, religion says that all started from Adam and Eve, but evolutionary theory disproves this. If evolutionary theory is falsified, there could be some validity to Adam and Eve. And then after instruction, the same student said evolution coincides with religion and there's no reason that it can't. But then we even saw this among non-religious students. So this non-religious student said before instruction, it's a can of worms, evolution and religion. It's a fight that will keep being waged until the end of time. So pretty intense. And then just 2 weeks later, the same student said they can agree. Okay. And among religious students, when we looked among their responses to see what might have been causing this reduction in conflict, they often said that they simply did not know that they could accept evolution and be religious. So for instance, this religious student said, this helped me see that it is possible to have religion and science both within your life. It helped me to realize that I do not necessarily have to pick one over the other. But what about non-religious students? What was causing their reduction in conflict? We didn't expect that. So we very much implemented this with religious students in mind. And when we saw non-religious students reduce conflict, we were very interested to see, their open-ended responses, if they might give us some indication as to what happened with that. Well, and what we found is that it seemed that the non-religious students really appreciated seeing our religious individuals in science. So they kind of reduced their negative stereotypes about religious individuals in science. So for instance, this student said, I appreciated that scientists are able to be considered religious without it compromising their research. Whereas this student said, I appreciated that there are people who believe in evolution who are religiously affiliated because it showed me that they did not let their religion interfere with fact. Okay, so now I'm going to ask you to get a little bit involved again and answer in the chat, because I want to get your input. I want to get what you think. We didn't expect this. Why do you think it might be beneficial, or is it beneficial to have an impact on non-religious students? So throw your ideas in the chat. I'll give you all about like 30 seconds to throw some ideas out there. Because they're more likely to end up as evolution teachers in the future. They could be future educators, somebody said. Right? Great. All right, so yeah, so when we started thinking about the implications of this result, we started thinking back to our interviews, right? And how instructors at public colleges often do not address perceived conflict because of their own negative stereotypes about religion. So if we can help encourage non-religious individuals to be more culturally competent as future evolution instructors themselves, that might be beneficial. And even if they don't become evolution instructors, maybe they'll be more likely to talk to their friends and family in a more culturally competent way about evolution instruction. Okay, so I know what some of you are probably thinking, which is, this is all great, but I do not have 2 hours in my class to spend implementing religious cultural competence and evolution education. And I know that at least some of you are probably thinking that, because that's what many instructors in our interviews said. They said, I have too much to teach to worry about adding this extra stuff. So we condensed all of our religious cultural competence down to a 6-minute introduction that can be implemented at the beginning of an evolution module. And basically this 6-minute introduction, it looked a lot like the presentation of Reese that I showed you just a few minutes ago when I listed all the practices and I showed you some of those slides. A lot of that was part of that introduction that we implemented. We put scientist role models on a PowerPoint slide, talked about the presentation of spectrum of viewpoints on a PowerPoint slide. So it was a relatively short one. So we wanted to see if this would make a difference. And these are data from students in an introductory biology course at a public university in Arizona, in which we implemented the 6 minutes. And all of these students are students in the class who indicated at the start of an evolution module that they perceived some conflict with evolution and their religion. So the beginning of the arrows indicates their level of perceived conflict between religion and evolution at the start of their evolution instruction, and then the end of the arrows indicate their level of perceived conflict after their instruction with RISI. So if there's a dot instead of an arrow, that means the student didn't change. So this was only one class and 10 students in that class who perceived conflict, but through interviews and pre-post survey data, we did see a positive shift among 8 out of 10 of those students. Okay, so we can reduce conflict with 6 minutes, but what about among a population that might be especially resistant towards evolution, such as evangelical Christians? So can cultural competence reduce their conflict? So this figure shows data from another paper that we published, not using the 6 minutes, but using a different RISI intervention among an upper level genetics course at a conservative evangelical Christian university in which they were taught evolution using RISI. So now this class and the last class were actually about the same size, but we had a few more students in this population that perceived conflict at the beginning of the course, given the population. So we have more students on this graph than the last graph. And what we again found through interviews and pre-post survey data was that the RISI helped reduce students' conflict between religion and evolution. However, it is worth noting that among the evangelical students, this was a whole semester long intervention in which the students read an entire book compared to the 6-minute intervention from the last class at the public university. So, and yet we saw a smaller proportion of students change at the evangelical university. So this indicates to us that although RISI can be effective with evangelical students, this population does seem to be much more resistant to change. So those are some studies so far that have provided efficacy evidence for using cultural competence on evolution education. But in order to explore the generalizability of these results, we need larger studies with multiple classes and comparison groups in our research design. So our team was awarded an NSF grant to explore the efficacy of this RISI framework across courses nationwide. And today I'm really excited to have some new unpublished pilot study results to share with you. So for this study, we collected data from students in 14 courses with 10 different instructors in 8 states before and after evolution instruction to see if we could compare student outcomes based on whether instructors were using the RISI practices. As predictor variables, we measured student religiosity and whether instructors were using some select RISI practices. So this measure is still under development. Oh wait, hold on. Sorry, So we measured, I was talking about the predictor variables. We measured religiosity as our predictor variables, as well as whether the instructors were using culturally competent evolution education. And as outcome variables, we measured student change in acceptance of evolution, as well as change in their perceived conflict between religion and evolution, and the extent to which they felt comfortable learning evolution at the end of the semester. So our measure, so we had to create an entire new measure to indicate whether or not instructors were using religious cultural competence in evolution education. And so far, we've been able to validate skills for 3 different RISI practices. So the first scale that we were able to validate is a scale in which students reported whether the instructor was using religious scientist role models while teaching evolution. We also uncovered a new practice through our validation process, which we called decision autonomy. And these items asked students to report the extent to which instructors gave them autonomy over their decision whether to accept evolution. And the third scale was a scale that measured negative practices. So these are practices that could be considered non-culturally competent. And they asked students to report the extent to which instructors seem negative about religion and religious people. So, given these scales, to what extent do students perceive that instructors are using these practices? And we were able to find that students did indeed perceive variation. So there was variation across the instructor. Each color in each graph on the x-axis represents a different instructor. And the y-axis represents students' average agreement from strongly disagree to strongly agree that an instructor was using each practice. So there was variation in student perceptions of each practice across instructors, with decision autonomy being perceived as used the most across instructors and religion negativity the least, which is probably a good thing. But what we really wanted to know is how is this variation related to student outcomes? So for this graph, on the x-axis, we have student perceptions that the instructor provided religious scientist role models while teaching evolution. And the y-axis is student change in human evolution acceptance over the semester. There are 4 trend lines that you see here, and each line represents students from different religiosity levels. And so now I want you to brainstorm on your own, which trend line do you think is from the most religious students and why? I'll give you about 10 seconds to think about that. All right, so as many of you might have guessed, the orange line represents students from the highest religiosity levels. And our results showed that these students' increase in human evolution acceptance was statistically significantly associated with the perception that the instructor provided religious scientist role models. We found similar results when looking at the outcome of comfort learning evolution. So more comfort learning evolution among religious students at all levels actually was associated with a greater perception that the instructor used religious scientist role models, with the practice seeming particularly impactful for highly religious students. All right, but what about religion negativity? So how was this non-culturally competent practice associated with student outcomes? So for these results, the x-axis is the change in students' perceived conflict between religion and evolution over the semester. So we found that when highly religious students perceived that the instructor used more negativity about religion while teaching evolution, that their perception of conflict between evolution and personal religious beliefs increased. Okay, so those are our pilot results from our multi-classroom study. We already have collected more than 7,000 student responses across about 50 courses for our main study, and we're currently working on the analyses for those results, so stay tuned for that in the future. But one thing I often get asked when presenting this work is, why should we care? Why should we care about religious students at all? And so I often remind folks that more than half of students in biology classes are religious nationwide. So if you want to make an impact on a large number of students, using RECE might be a good way to do that. But perhaps just as important is that minoritized students in biology, such as Black and Hispanic students, as well as students who are women, tend to be more religious than their white male counterparts. So if we're teaching in a way that is not culturally competent for religious students, we may be inadvertently disadvantaging underrepresented minorities. And this is particularly concerning for the fields of ecology and evolutionary biology. So consider this graph, which shows data from the US Census and National Center for Education Statistics. So the black dotted lines are the percent of the United States population that's Black, Asian, or Hispanic. And the bars are the percent of PhDs awarded to these groups within different fields of biology, including biomedical sciences, nursing, ecology, and evolutionary biology. So if the dotted line is above a bar for our particular group, that means that that group is underrepresented in that discipline compared to the general public. And what we've known for some time now is that minoritized students are underrepresented in most fields of biology. However, more recently, researchers are noticing that Black students are severely minoritized in specifically ecology and evolutionary biology, with only 1% of PhDs going to Black individuals in those fields between the years of 2015 and 2017. So why? Why is it that we have such an absence of students from one particular race in one field? So we wanted to explore some potential answers to this question through a study in which we asked, can higher rates of religiosity among Black students explain lower rates of evolution acceptance? Because prior polls had shown in the general public that Black individuals tend to be more religious, right? And if they don't, and religiosity is related to acceptance of evolution. If you don't accept evolution, that's a really big barrier to pursuing a career in ecology or evolutionary biology. So we emailed instructors across the nation and asked them if they would forward a survey to their students that included measures of evolution acceptance, religiosity, and religious denomination, as well as a question asking students to indicate their racial or ethnic identity. And we also collected control measures for potentially confounding factors such as gender, age, and socioeconomic status. We ended up getting data from almost 10,000 students in 77 classes in 17 US states. And it was really this large sample size that allowed us to disaggregate students of color in our analyses. All right, so in terms of religiosity, what do our students in biology classes look like? Well, our students actually look very similar to what we see in public polls. These are violin plots of students' religiosity levels broken down by racial or ethnic identification. The shapes of the violin represent the density of the data at that specific point on the y-axis. So for instance, among white students, you see that there's a large number of students who are of average religiosity here at the 0 on the y-axis. Now, the black solid line represents the median of the data. So, for instance, the median of Black student religiosity is higher than students from any other racial or ethnic group. You also see, based on the violin plot, that there's a large aggregation of students at the highest point of the religiosity scale compared to students from any other racial or ethnic group. And conversely, there are very few Black students who fall on the low end of the religiosity scale, indicating very few Black students are not religious. So each letter at the top indicates whether there's a statistically significant difference between groups of students. And if a group shares a letter, they're not statistically different from one another. So for instance, Black students do not share a B with any other group because they were found to be statistically significantly more religious than any other racial or ethnic group, while Asian and white students share the letter A because they had similar levels of religiosity. One point that is important to consider is that religion can be framed as a strength of a student's identity. For instance, consider that religiosity has been shown to mitigate the negative effects of racism and oppression. But what about students' acceptance of evolution? What did that look? So we actually measured 3 aspects of evolution acceptance because students tend to have different levels of microevolution, macroevolution, and human evolution acceptance. And we found that Black students were less accepting than students from any other racial or ethnic group in all cases. We see the exact opposite pattern of religiosity in that Black students scored lower than any other racial or ethnic group on these measures. But there was a particularly prominent gap between groups on their acceptance of human evolution scores. So when looking at the Black student population, there are almost no Black students that are highly accepting of human evolution. Further, the median and most dense portion of the distribution of data points lie at a point lower than the overall average of the population and lower than that of students from any race or ethnicity. But what about our research question? So does the higher religiosity of Black students actually explain their evolution acceptance? We use mediation analyses to explore this question. So a mediation analysis helps to determine if the relationship between 2 variables can be explained by a third confounding variable. So in this case, the relationship between race and evolution acceptance may be the result of a third variable, religiosity. So here is a big scary table that gives a lot of information for those of you who are familiar and would like to see the details. However, for those of you who are not so familiar, I want to bring your attention to a few important numbers. So first is the coefficient for the mediation effect, which is the average change in evolution acceptance that would occur if the measures of religiosity observed among Black or Hispanic students were the same as white students. For Black students, we see there would be a significant change in evolution acceptance coefficients, but with Black students, we did not see the same trend, indicating that their religiosity wasn't as important, determining the gap between student acceptance of evolution. Next is the proportion mediated. So this is the amount of the gap between white and Black students that is accounted for by religiosity differences between groups. Now, we don't show these numbers for Hispanic students because their mediation effect was so low. For Black students, 32% of the gap in microevolution acceptance scores could be explained by higher religiosity levels. And for acceptance of macro and human evolution, this was even more pronounced. Almost half the gap between Black and white student evolution acceptance scores could be explained by religiosity differences between the 2 groups. All right, so given these data, now I'm going to argue that we need to reduce the perceived conflict between religion and science to create more inclusive biology education. Students perceive a disproportionate amount of conflict between religion and evolution than actually exists. So for instance, one of our recent studies found that 57% of students in introductory biology think that people have to be atheists in order to accept evolution. And this perception was associated with lower evolution acceptance among highly religious students only. Further, the biology community has not been welcoming of religious individuals, particularly Christians. Our experimental social psychology study showed that biologists can be biased against highly religious Christians and that they rate highly religious PhD applicants as less likable, less competent, and less hireable than non-religious applicants. And students perceive this bias. Over half of students in one study said that they perceived discrimination against Christians to be a problem in science. And Christian graduate students report that their Christianity is a stigmatized identity that they sometimes feel they need to conceal in the context of their biology programs. So if we want to improve the diversity of evolutionary biology and ecology, we're going to have to change these patterns in biology and reduce perceived conflict between religion, biology, and evolution. Okay, so in a quick review, what we've talked about today is first that the religious cultures and beliefs of evolution instructors and their students are often different, and that this difference can present a barrier for effective evolution education. That religious cultural competence in evolution education can help instructors reduce perceived conflict among their students. That RISI may help non-religious students become more culturally competent evolution instructors themselves in the future. And that RISI may help improve the experiences, could help improve the experiences of Black students learning about evolution. And with that, I will end and take any questions that you all have. Thank you all so much for listening.
All right, well, thank you, Liz. Everybody, let's give Liz a virtual round of applause. Great, thanks a lot.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Okay, so anybody that's got questions for Liz, please put them in the chat, and I will moderate them here. Our first one comes from Sarah. Sarah asks, in the religious versus non-religious studies, how are students bend into religious or not? I know from some psych literature, religious and spirituality are themselves on spectrums.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So we have two ways of indicating religious identity. So the first way is just identification, right? So we give a list of religious denominations as well as an option to not identify with a religion. And then we say, which one do you most closely identify with? And that's the easiest way to separate them, because then you can just put all the non-religious students in one bin and then like everybody who affiliated with a religion in another one. But that's not usually how I input them in the analyses though. So the most common way that I do it is I have a validated scale used in social psychology of religion that has about four to eight items, depending on the study that we do it with, in which students ask, like, we ask them, to what extent do you identify as religious? How important is your religious identity to you? How often do you participate in religious services, right? And then we take those who fall in the upper half of the scale as religious individuals and those who fall at the lower half of the scale as non-religious individuals, or we use it as a continuous variable in our regression models.
Great. Mary has a comment. Would you be able to do this presentation for Tulsa Community College faculty? This is great. And she'd like for you to email her your paper to her.
Yeah, absolutely. I would. My email is right down there. If you shoot me an email, I will definitely do that. And I would love to come talk at the community college. I have not given a seminar at community colleges yet, and I've wanted to. So that would be a great opportunity. Thank you.
So I think following up on that, Diane kind of asked what was on my mind after seeing Mary's comment. It'd be interesting to see what data you would get from HBCUs and community colleges, and if instructors at HBCUs, if their results might be different.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think so. First of all, I wonder if we might actually see more RISI practices being used in community colleges, just because instructors might be more cognizant of their students' identities given the smaller class sizes and the closer relationships they might be having with their students at community colleges. But I can't, that's all conjecture, right? I don't know for sure. I'm really excited to start doing studies with community college instructors. And HBCUs is another interesting thing that we've thought about. And when we've talked to folks at HBCUs, they've said that often evolution is not taught at HBCUs even. So it makes it an even more challenging environment to kind of study RISI practices, because how do you study instructional practices for a topic that isn't being taught, right? In a lot of these places. So, which I thought was interesting to hear.
Great. Okay. Well, I guess I have a question that I'll throw here. You know, at least in the U.S., I don't know how true this is elsewhere, but in the U.S., religiosity and political preference are kind of tied up together. And just since you started this work, I would say that level of conflict has increased fairly dramatically. And I'm curious if you've seen over the course of your studies that impacting the level of conflict people see between religion and evolution or science in general.
Yeah, so that's interesting. I don't have like robust results that we ran to report to you for that, but I can tell you what I've seen trends in the data I've been collecting over the last 7 years, as well as my colleagues who I've talked to, is that first, 10 years ago, in the literature, we did not see a very big association with political affiliation and evolution acceptance. So if you just ran correlations, you'd see it. But it was because there was a confounding variable of religiosity, right? If you controlled for religiosity, political affiliation didn't matter anymore, right? But what we're starting to see now when I'm talking to my colleagues and when I'm collecting my data is that we're starting to see a unique impact of political affiliation on evolution acceptance, albeit small. So I have noticed that. Once again, this isn't a published study. This is just kind of my observations of the data we've been collecting, but it seems that political affiliation is becoming more uniquely affiliated with evolution rejection over the years. But I haven't seen a raise, like maybe you're asking, like, have you seen the conflict raise over the last, 5 years or so? And no, not that I can tell. We haven't seen that conflict raise.
That's good. Mm-hmm. So Diane comments that some professors, I guess Diane's one of them, at HBCUs do teach evolution.
HBC, is Diane at HBCU?
Yes, I think she's at Alabama State. Diane, is that where you're from?
Oh, great. Well, that's really great to hear. Maybe I'll reach out to you if I interview instructors at HBCUs.
And I would point out that one of the greatest evolutionary biologists I know, Joe Graves, is.
Oh yes. He's actually the one that told me. So when I talked to him, he was the one that told me that so he teaches evolution, obviously. Yes. But he was like, it might be hard to study evolution classes because they're less prevalent at HBCUs. So, but yeah, obviously they're out there, and I would be really interested to see like how that context changes. And thinking about Joe Graves, for instance, he gives talks on how his own racial, ethnic, and religious identity have influenced the way that he teaches evolution to his students. And he uses what I would consider religious cultural competence in evolution education. Yeah, good point.
Does anybody else have a question?
I agree, Diane. Thank you for your comment.
All right, well, if nobody else has any further questions or comments, let's give Liz another round of applause, and thank you for coming today.
Thank you all so much for having me. It was great. If anybody has any questions or anything, feel free to email me.
Great. Thanks, Liz.
Thank you.
Everybody else next month.